Another variation of a popular creation myth says that when Adam received his thinking cap and was shown the garden gate, once outside, now on his own, and the first one to take steps on the road toward individual consciousness, that he split into two separate Adams. The religious Adam, whose search and longing seemed to be for a return to the original peace and certainty of life in the pre-mental garden, and the warrior Adam, whose life from there on out appeared to be driven by a hunger for something not yet experienced, a desire to find and explore a new land. All in all, a longing to live in the morrow, in an internal place where in the past assumed supernatural external forces became the conditions of his own personal inner state of awareness. In the beginning, some look far away and some seek closer to home. But in the ultimate, everyone sees it to be in the exact same place. There is nowhere but everywhere, and nowhere to be but right therein. To help ration his time, one man decided he would not listen to anyone defend or explain themselves, including his heroes, who, should they, no longer were. Consciousness in the knowing mode, as opposed to the thinking, can be like a bullet fired which somehow manages to meet itself in midair, thereby canceling out all normal expectations of an outcome. On his bottom step one day, a man found a message painted in red. The next day, on the next higher step, he found a message written in blue. Then on the day after that, on the next step above that, he found a message written in yellow. And when he opened his back door on the following morning, the man discovered that his steps had disappeared. The reason that warriors are never heard to pray is that, to civilian ears, inverted echoes are imperceptible. Thinking does not know where it's going, and only those free from it can direct their steps properly. The voice cried out, "Who runs this planet?" And the crowd shouted back, "Humans!" "And who runs humans?" "Humans," they shouted back. "And who's that answering these questions?" the voice asked. "You know damn well who," they replied. Consciousness, down to even more specific definitions. Consciousness, when in the automatic thinking mode, is not simply consciousness, but is then constricted consciousness. The cry of the common captive. "Help, I'm trapped and I can't get out. Help, I'm trapped and I don't know where. Help, I'm trapped and I'm not sure why. Help, never mind, I've got no real idea what I'm talking about." End quote. More men have drowned in imaginary seas than any who actually swam. One guy asked himself, "Is it an acceptable excuse to not know what you're doing?" And answered, "Yes, if you don't know what you're doing." Then had to lay down and loosen his shorts to be sure that everything was still A-OK at his end of the pool. On the mystical path, two men met, one in the garb of a monk, the other in the guise of a warrior, and asked one another what the difference was in their approaches, and the one traveling as a monk said, "I ask God for help in my struggle." And the warrior thought, "I demand and expect of me all that is required." And when they parted ways, each left a bit envious of the other. Do note that this is a tale of purely allegorical intent. If you worry about death, you miss out on life. And if you worry about ignorance, you miss out on knowing. Inside of human consciousness is the only place in this universe wherein the more intensely you search for a certain substance, the more does it evade discovery. Which is why so many people dream favorably about another reality, even if it is called death. Man is the only creature who believes that by removing the air from a balloon, he might be able to get a better view of the inside of the balloon. That means think about it, damn it. Most of those who call themselves alive say that they don't understand being alive. And few of those alive realize that the problem is in being too full of what is normally thought of as being alive. And only the ordinary think of some things as being so basic and necessary to existence as to have but one definition. There was once a world in which the paramount creatures were cows. And they did all the things that men do on this one. And one in particular that was noteworthy was that a few of them would don fancy clothes and wave about physical symbols, while the rest of them would fall in line and head in most any direction pointed to by the few. And as always, for the truly perceptive listener, you may ignore the background of this being a story about cows and how some among them might apparently lead the rest about and realize it to be addressing the situation inside your own mind of how life-produced thinking rises up to naturally take charge of all your available consciousness, which, under routine conditions, appears to have no discernible destination or clear-cut purpose of its own. That's why you never hear warrior cowboys singing on a cattle drive. They don't drive cattle, nor are they driven. Yippee-i-o. There was once a race of creatures who, had they lived up to their own advertising, would have concluded themselves to be idiots. They did admit to some degree to be failures, but this was just a sidestepping of the matter noted. It's a good thing you don't have to think about these, isn't it? Damn right it is. The dean of a certain mystical school said to the graduating class, "If you ever attempt to speak on our subject to others, and while so doing have a specific audience in mind, you are doomed to failure. And for you real sharpies in the crowd, let me add, you can use what I just told you in your own dealings with your own thinking." End academic quote. There was once a mystical warrior who changed professions and became a boxer. Said he might as well get paid for getting beat up. The head of a certain mystical school one day said to himself, "Get a grip." And he did. And took a trip. A long, long trip. Far from where he started, far from where he had been. To a place where the only form of contention known was shadow boxing. And even it was unknown. Get a grip indeed. The simple complain about the without. The more complex turn their complaints in part on themselves. While a man involved in the struggle has no one to blame and nothing to complain about other than, well, it's not necessary to verbally get into that again. Those so involved know what it is, and those who are not will never understand it no matter how often it's described. People who only know what they know through thinking don't know anything. Though an ordinary life is a pretend life, it is not actually a bogus life. if an ordinary life is what you're satisfied with. Conversation never overheard. Anyone who makes an absolute, unequivocal, dogmatic statement about man isn't thinking. Contraire, that's exactly what they're doing. Thinking. Oh, I get it. You're right. Extreme destinations. The trip, the trick. Super trains run on but a single track. There was once a land with some non-standard creatures who could only make their way by the continual redefining of all that was known, which certainly included the language. Inside, one kingdom was once two opposing factions who continually shot at one another. This kingdom was one man's consciousness, and the two factions were not actually in conflict and did not, in truth, shoot at one another. Well, let me restate that. They were not actually in conflict, but they did, in fact, fire at one another. You know, that still doesn't sound right. If they weren't really in opposition to one another, then why would they act like they were? This story is too weird to go on with, if you ask me. Wonder why men don't find it too weird to go on with inside their own heads. There was once a time in another universe. Once upon a time in another universe, there was a gigantic creature bred for racing. But to run properly, it had to continually limp and favor first one leg, then the other. Once upon a time at another reality's turf, some beings evolved who, rather than running around in circles themselves, conceived of the idea of private boxes overlooking the track, wherein they could sit with a nice drink and pleasant company and observe the action, not only comfortably, but profitably. Where opposing forces are taken to be, there will staggering pass as they sprint. Once men believed they lived in the midst of gods, then conceived of living with differing versions of themselves within. But beyond that, no one seems to know where to go with it next. As he squatted on the launch pad next to his rocket, a man thought, if I could ever get this match lit, I could get this thing airborne. Maybe I should start reading these in English. Well, or whatever your native tongue proved to be. After reaching a certain stage in his efforts and understanding, one man deleted from his reading any books which had in their title the words philosophy, doctrine, or belief, such as the philosophy of the Sufis, the doctrines of Zen, or the beliefs of Buddhism. And on a more mundane note, one guy with a car was only interested in driving instructions and not in the theory of locomotion. Legend tells of one warrior who was so intense that every time he thought anything about himself, he died a little. Okay, perhaps fables are more to your liking. The true distinction between a lion and buzzards and hyenas is that a lion never thinks about himself. Yes, Wiggles viewers appreciatively. I do not mind having train wrecks reported to me, as long as they do not occur near my house. And how many more times must such matters be covered before you realize that what's being spoken of is no less, no more than the very nature and proper workings of human thinking. Thinking, that is, not the other possibility within consciousness. If, as the ordinary like to imagine, there was an evil force loose on this planet, intent on capturing man, it's too late to worry about it. Because if you've thought about it, it's already got you. Wow, said one man, don't you just love justice? Especially after it's run over your dick and it's too late to do anything about it. There was once a band of extraordinary judicial explorers whose interest was in the discovery of justice before any judgment was rendered. Boy, did they have the field to themselves. Some of the best news a mystic will ever hear is that it's too late, somebody else is already him. We can all dream. Regarding the need to help and correct others, those who preach, preach to themselves. Oh. Oh, help me. The ordinary worry about numerous things slipping up on them, such as old age, illness, and death. The few worry about but one thing slipping up on them, thinking, and its spiriting away of awareness. That's the only trouble. You can't wave because you don't know when it goes. Best you can do is go, oh, you're back. Help us, Jesus. Help us, Lord. Along his great quest, one man had a rallying cry he had periodically shout out to those appropriate internal parts of himself, which was, hooray, friends and neighbors, sit on something sharp and uncomfortable. The man could have been a preacher, I guess. Between skirmishes, a warrior sat in his tent, reflecting on the nature and usefulness of beating up on oneself, but was suddenly brought back to consciousness by the awareness that there is no such thing for a true warrior as between skirmishes. Although unrealized at the outset, going off on a great mystical quest is believing that fish are drowning and eagles can scarce stay aloft. Oh, what a web of confusion we weave when we at first begin to believe that we know what we're doing. Of course, it can't be helped and it can't be otherwise. The question is, will you wake up in time? He is not a warrior who is not where the battle is, and he is no warrior whose mind is not where he is. Another word regarding thinking and the view thereof presently taken herein. If you don't see the problem with thinking, then you don't have one. Two release in one night. And both of them full. One guy asked another guy, what is a mystic? Someone who knows the secret of God? Nope. Someone who knows the secret of death? Nope. Someone who knows the secret of the mysteries? Nope. I've got it. Someone who knows what the hell's going on around here? You got it. Not floral news. From one view, the only use of thinking for the few is to continually freshen it up. There is a total difference between feelings of guilt and self-condemnation and the warrior's being relentless on himself for the sake of the prize. As regards the requirement for extraordinary sight, death can be a real eye-opener. When you understand enough of your native tongue that it all becomes metaphor, then nothing is. And is, again, becomes simply is. There was once a man who painted roses red, then began to paint them blue, and after that painted them black and white and polka dot, and finally red again, at which point he suddenly saw the light, realizing that they had been red to begin with. When your understanding is sufficient, all thought becomes metaphorical. Then when it surpasses that, it is no longer merely representative of anything. Thought becomes thought, and things go back to being what they were. Yes, sir. Death can be a real eye-opener and an unexpected pick-me-up. Since the news of the day brought up the subject already, consider that there is a difference. We've already had it pointed out numerous times here, which should be obvious, that all ordinary, civilized, sane men are to varying degrees dissatisfied based upon what role men are playing here, based upon the fact that man is an unfinished work. Along with this dissatisfaction to varying degrees goes feelings of guilt and self-condemnation. But there is a very distinct difference that is never noted, and it's almost impossible to talk about, but that shan't stop us, shall it? Between the ordinary person's feeling of some sort of self-condemnation, a kind of, to various intensities, beating up on oneself, and what was mentioned as a warrior's relentlessness on himself, having to do with the prize, having to do with his goal. But let's make a simple premise to start with, is that you have everybody on the planet to some degree internally beating up on himself. Everybody, including mystics, let's just go ahead and call it that to start with. But there is a difference. The distinction being, notice, it's never thought about, but it's not a theory. I'm pointing out simply life as it is. You can see it in you and you can see it external to you. People normally beat up on themselves on the basis, in relationship to some external standard. That people beat up on themselves, if they claim to be a Christian, for instance, only on the basis that they do not meet whatever they consider the standards which they have accepted from somewhere, but whatever they consider to be this means external, either that or I have a Charlie horse in my bicep and just wanted to move my arm. That feels good, you know. That's almost as good as being a Christian. In fact, I guess it is half of being a Christian, isn't it? All ordinary people, if they're sane, if they're civilized, I'll repeat, we've been through it again, and it doesn't not have to be simply on a religious basis, but one of the definitions of being sane and ordinary and being a routine type person is that you do not believe that you are entirely finished, adequate, up to standards. Even if someone harbors such suspicions in themselves, you should all realize by now that if you ask such a person, if they consider themselves a finished piece of work, perfect, no complaints about themselves, even if, as I said, they might cherish certain little illusions off in private, they certainly will not publicly admit it. We all know that. That would be a sign, a sure sign that someone, from ordinary views, that somebody is in a serious way mentally disturbed. Because no sane person will claim to be perfect, to claim to be sans flaws. So a person, all ordinary sane people, as part of the definition of being ordinary and sane, will claim, will admit to, but even profess to be, with sufficient flaws, thank you, that I am no. We are not perfect. We're still struggling. We're all on our way. Now, they can use that, or if you press them, they might refer to the fact that they have yet to meet the standards of being, and then you can fill in the blank. Could be being a Christian, a Jew, a good Italian, just a good human. But notice this, it is always, because we're dealing now with thinking, it is always on the basis of something, some external standard. The difference between ordinary people beating up on themselves and the kind of relentless form of, it is a kind of beating up, but I'll leave that terminology a minute. I just wanted to start off and show that there is a common, apparent, verbal basis between, or amongst everybody. That everybody is dissatisfied and everyone, to some degree, is beating up on themselves. All the way from the sane, the ordinary, the absolutely catatonic, albeit perhaps with numerous degrees and areas of expertise, just ordinary people whose consciousness is limited to the thinking mode. They're beating up on themselves, because that's the nature of thinking. And those who are not necessarily limited to thinking, or at least they're not satisfied that thinking is the extent, the full realization of consciousness, they too beat up on themselves. I mean, that's why we're here. That's why people tune me in, is to hear me beat up on them in a certain way. And for them to think, yeah, that's true. Except here's the difference. At the ordinary level, when the feeling of self-condemnation, the beating up on oneself on the basis I am not yet a good Buddhist or Sufi or anything, it's always on the basis there's an external standard that is known, and the person is saying, I cannot meet that standard. And therefore, shame on me, I'm working on it perhaps, but no, I don't meet the standard. What I meant by a warrior tonight, someone who is attempting to pursue, to establish, to nourish the knowing mode of consciousness, the non-thinking, not limited to thinking mode of consciousness. The beating up of their self on themselves is not in relationship to anything thought about. There is no apparent external standard by which, or because of which, they're beating up on themselves. This has practical significance, believe it or suck a prune. If you ask, let me make up one of my made-up stories, if I may. Why not? Make it up the rest of it. Why not make up a story within it? If you could catch a mystic, if you had that kind of magical salt, and he had a large enough tail, and you could catch a mystic, and have you trick a mystic, it's something to do with, I can't remember now, it's something to do with putting a troll in a bag under his bridge. But anyway, and you force a mystic to tell you the truth, and you had him alone, and you said, I've heard tales, or all of us ordinary humans, to varying degrees, we're beating up on ourselves. He'd go, yep. He'd go, does that happen with guys like you? He'd go, yep. And you'd say, well, can you explain it to me? I beat up on myself because, here's what I think, is I beat up on myself because I was raised to be a Muslim. My family is good, Orthodox Muslims. I've drifted away. My family are Persian. I have drifted away from our culture. I've drifted away from religion, and I'm continually feeling guilty. I continually beat up myself. You know what I mean? The mystic said, yeah. Oh yeah, I know what you mean. And so you say to the mystic, maybe put a little more salt on his tail just to be sure. Or shake that troll a little bit more and make it rattle in that bag, which is a real trick in a croaker sack to make a troll rattle, but you can. At any rate, to intensify the possibility, if not the certainty, that the mystic will tell you the truth. So you ask the mystic, you say, so you understand about the basis of me beating up on myself? And he goes, huh? And you go, well, and you said that there was something similar in your life. And yeah. You go, well, can you explain it? Is there anything resembling mine? You go, You go, but you understand what I'm talking about. And you go, but that's not the basis upon which you're beating up on yourself. And you go, well, come on now. I spent the money for the salt, caught a troll, bought a croaker sack. Come on, tell me the truth. Explain the basis on which you are beating up on yourself. It's impossible. Strictly impossible. And if for no other practical use, some of you might now understand why you have never been able to respond to anyone who asked you what the hell you was up to, or when you did respond, you felt like that somebody, instead of putting salt on your tail, had stuck it on your tongue. There is no description. And it's not for any mystical reason. We're back to the fact that consciousness, which is all this is involved with, we're not talking about anything external to man, we're talking about everything totally internally to a man and totally in an area somewhere north of the neck. That we're talking about two possibilities. That there is the thinking, as I was calling it, the thinking mode, that's everything that you ever think, including about being a Persian, being a mystic, being a Muslim, being an Italian, being anything. Then whatever you're thinking about is never satisfying, is always liable to description, damn liable. I was going to say begs for description, but then I'd have to say damn begs. It insists on speaking up and describing in ways that amount to beating up on oneself about. I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you the kind of guy. I'm going to tell you the kind of guy I am. God knows I'm not a perfect guy. All I know is I got my faults. But I'm going to tell you the kind of guy I am. I'm not satisfied with my fault. Oh, in fact, wait a minute. You got a second? Of course, I don't like this to get around, but I'm going to tell you what. I got a drug problem. And I certainly don't want this to get around. You got another second? You got any friends that want to listen to this too? I got all kinds of sexual secrets. I've got all kinds of criminal activities that are hit. Call in your friends. You got some. I mean, I hate for this to get out. As long as you can talk about what it is that's bothering you bunky, you can beat up on yourself. And as long as you can talk about it from a non-thinking view, it is not worth talking about. The beating up of oneself, if you can follow this, under ordinary conditions, is why the beating up on oneself never gets anywhere. It never gets anywhere in a religious context, or even in a secular context. That is, under psychological auspices as opposed to religious. That through self-confession or through confession to another, a paid professional, it does not alleviate, it never concludes, never satisfies the need to beat up on oneself. Thinking can be equated with beating up on oneself. Knowing is the only solution. Knowing is the only state in which a man does not beat up on himself. Now, I am sure that it would be easier, if not, I don't mean to be improper, for some people to hear this and in their own mind take the term beating up on oneself to be a bit of verbal hyperbole. And I did it to get a little attention to the fact, but it is the feeling in the mind of any sane, ordinary person again, that anything that you think, and specifically about man, that is about internal matters, is never satisfactory. Now, I point out again, for those of you that forgot it or didn't hear it, as always, there are all sorts of beautiful little quirks, curlicues, and doodads that life has provided. And one of them is that through thinking, men can apparently, in external matters, establish some things for certainty. But remember now, this is still in the mode of thinking, but such as mathematics, that they can establish that 2 times 5 is 10, and 2 times 5 is 10, no matter where you go, no matter what time of day it is, no matter what your religion is, no matter what your education is, no matter your age, no matter anything. By God, 2 times 5 is 10. the interesting little doily that life places on your side table, on which you attempt to set your pleasant drink, your snack, and then pick it back up and think, perhaps this could be a mirror and has something to do with men also, or at least perhaps the mind is capable, thought is capable of arriving at such certainties if I turn it internally. There's a great thing about being a human. And some of you already know what it is. In fact, like me stating it again, let's just say there's one really, really, really great thing about being a human, and that is blank. Fill it in. You can't go wrong. You can't go wrong. You can say that we have freedom of will, or you can say we're a bunch of idiots. That's the great thing about being a human. Back to thinking. Thinking is of such a nature that if you're ordinary, again, that you are just in the middle of life's parade, that you're a sane, routine type person, you are beating up on yourself, and of course everyone understands I mean this not physically, and I mean it in ways that would not ordinarily be considered neurotic or psychotic, that you're not actually doing yourself damage, you don't have a phobia to the point that it is physically incapacitating you or harming you. If you're just an ordinary person, you, to some degree, beat up on yourself. You beat up on yourself to some degree if you're working a crossword puzzle and you see a definition, blah, 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 and you count, it's 8 letters, and you go, oh my God. And as people say, I know what it is, but I can't think of it. Damn! That's beating up on yourself. I know it seems to be of no great consequence. That is the nature of thinking, is what I am intending you to consider. Now, it goes all the way from that, which might be considered, I guess, one of the milder forms, but now consider into the area wherein people take religious ideas, spiritual ideas, even so-called metaphysical ideas seriously. Then they can beat up on themselves with a certain increased amount of vigor. At times, a vitriolic vigor. Any doubt about that? Simply turn on your TV, save yourself from going out in public, and find a channel with a fundamentalist preacher, which are just sort of an exaggeration of other things. It's just all on a continuing. Think of a synonym for spectrum. On a continuing spectrum. Think about it. Or you could be watching perhaps another non-commercial channel, if you were still dealing with a video, and be watching a marriage counselor, a psychologist, one of these people that have shows on PBS that giving psychological advice and talking about all the problems. It's the same thing as religion, but they, of course, normally have not as fancy duds. They don't have any good music. And if they call themselves doctor, it's probably at least based on some kind of degree that's not laughable. Like, oh well. Rather than stop there and pick on that area, which is funnier? In years past, it used to be sort of a minor joke, whether you got it to be at a party and somebody there and you say, oh, here's Dr. So-and-so. Especially in years past, and people be impressed, sometimes young girls or young women who are not yet married go, oh, a doctor. And they'd slide over, they go, what's your specialty? Plastic surgery or something? He goes, oh no, I'm a doctor of divinity or a doctor of economics. People go, I thought you was a real doctor. People outside the seriously academic community, to them, doctor, nobody even understands outside that area. Normally, they never consider their PhD, in literature. People come, oh, a doctor, ooh, and they get their drink, rush over to get some free advice, or, I got a daughter at home, I got a sister who's unmarried, and finally it's a doctor of English lit. I go, how can you be a doctor? What do you do? What, you operate on books? At any rate, we got to get back on the subject here. No, we don't. At any rate, I was just thinking in line with that, since I was at the point I was about to give a pseudo-dramatic, theatrical little kicking to doctoral degrees as they apply to fundamentalist religious persons, I was going to say, rather than leave it there and give them a little passing kick, is I was going to say, there could be things even more humorous. Or I was going to ask you rhetorically, which is the more humorous? To say, here's two men and they're both, Dr. Jones and Dr. Smith. At first you impress them, you find Dr. Jones, he is a doctor of divinity from some, Church of the Religious Sciences of Nashville, Tennessee. And you think, well, that's, kind of. And then you find the other guy, though, is a doctor from the University of Pennsylvania in meteorology. Economics. We're about to go back on the main path. I was trying to get you to consider that in the world of thinking, there are areas that are considered serious and worthy of note, such as a man who has a degree from a legitimate university in a real field, such as economics with a big E, and those from some night school in Nashville that's a doctor of divinity. That there's some degrees, some background, some training that's serious, and some that's not. See, that's the funniness. You missed the humor. That was the humor. The humor wasn't the doctor of divinity from a night school in Nashville. The humor was, in ordinary people thinking, there's a difference. That one of them is sort of funny and laughable, and the other is not. That's why it's laughable. Oh, well. All thinking, if you can see it to a degree that would be of any practical use to a person. If they, just at the ordinary level, if a person had what appeared to be, what they took to be a serious interest in the world of the intellect, then they are continually beating up on themselves, that is, feeling less than adequate, feeling as though they have yet to reach the proper level, that they are missing the mark, that they are not coming to satisfactory conclusions of any kind. But it is always, if you ask them about their lack of satisfaction, they can tell you why, easily. They can say, well, my area of expertise is so-and-so, and I have yet to get my PhD, or I have yet to understand some of the latest theories. Or if they're just referring to the fact of them attempting to understand the nature of man in themselves, they say, I cannot understand the nature of life. I don't understand why I behave as I do half the time. That sort of beating up on oneself is an absolute, from our kind of view, waste of time, and you should know it by now. It gets nowhere. It is part of the standard procedure of the ordinary parade, that as long as you march, as long as you're alive, and as long as you're ordinary with your intellect in ordinary working condition, you will beat up on yourself. You will feel to varying degrees guilty. You will condemn yourself. Someone involved with this, there is a similar kind of beating up on oneself, but it is not. Well, the reason I bring it up tonight is to get you to see that if it is tinged with guilt, or if you are still operating on the basis that it is because of some inadequacy in your thinking, it's about time you realize that as long as you're staying there in the area of thinking mode, it will always be thus. If you don't quit thinking about thinking, you'll always beat up on yourself to no avail. Yeah, we knew that would clear it up, didn't we? Don't be sarcastic with me. I'll refer you back to the news item. A warrior, between skirmishes, a warrior sat in his tent reflecting on the nature and purpose of the beating up on oneself. But was suddenly brought back to consciousness by the awareness that for a true warrior, there's no such thing as between skirmishes. Now may I translate that news story, since I, your humble servant, made it up. Between skirmishes would be, for a warrior, that is, someone whose consciousness was not limited to thinking. For a warrior, to be between skirmishes means one thing. He's back to friggin' thinking. Why else would he be sitting in his tent? Why else would he be reflecting on blank? All of that's thinking. there comes a point past which, no matter how intelligent you are, no matter how verbally or intellectually, even to yourself in private, glib and adroit you be, there's a point past which nothing but action counts. Mm-hmm. And then you have to understand that the action that people ordinarily take to be the defining or the definition of action is not to a warrior necessarily external. I had to put it to you another way. I can always put it another way, can't I? Boy, can you. I said watch it. The ultimate, and whatever you'd like to call it, the mystical quest, the great effort, the struggle, the march toward enlightenment, it does begin in thinking, because it only exists in consciousness. It exists nowhere else. There is no external awakening. There is no physical enlightenment. Your body is physically enlightened. The world out there is awake. It is what it is. It is only after man, Adam, has been given his thinking cap and shown the door, the gate to the garden, and here's slam, and he's suddenly outside. But he has his thinking cap. It is then that two things are possible. Or as I put it in the one story tonight, is Adam actually was split into two possibilities, into two atoms. One is almost everybody on the planet, ordinary people. They then began and continue to be in that great march towards somewhere. The great march of evolution, as far as humans are concerned, only starts once men have on their thinking caps. In a sense, it only starts with the individual. Once you reach the age, the stage in your life wherein you become verbal. You become an intellectual little nipper, at least verbal. It is only then that you individually become a meaningful part of the parade. And so after that, we have all of humanity. They're outside the gate. The original garden, which was silent, which was non-mental, consciousness was not in effect. When Adam was given his little thinking cap and shown the gate door, shown the garden gate door, he was out there on his own. And then the majority of humans then are marching forward, and they're using only the limping method, which is thinking. That's all they use. A few people somehow are wired up in such a way that they do not find thinking to be satisfactory, that does not adequately move them along. They do not even find it to be a balanced method of locomotion. They do not even find it to be a way to stand in a balanced condition. They do not find the position comfortable, no matter how they get. They can walk, they can stagger, they can sit down, they can lay down, they can just stand up straight, and something is not comfortable. They are not satisfied with the thinking mode. But as long as all you know is the thinking mode, you've got this going on that you're dissatisfied. There's no way out of it. You're supposed to be dissatisfied. You continue to beat up on yourself to no avail. Now, insofar as all the first group of atoms, that is humanity in general, of it being to no avail, that comment's to no avail. Because speaking of humanity as a whole, collectively, then any comment we make is irrelevant. I mean, what good does that do you? What if somebody knew? What if I knew exactly where humans are headed? And I said, well, I can take my word for it, this is it. Which I was thinking how absurd that is, but turn on another channel and There are people everywhere, all over the planet, for thousands of years, telling you exactly where humans are headed, because Allah said so right here in chapter 7, verse 14. Even if somebody tells you that, notice this, it does no good. It has no effect. It is only when you can be conscious without the resort, without the total dependence on thinking, that this kind of beating up on oneself has any usefulness. And then is when the term beating up on oneself becomes overblown and somewhat meaningless. Because it is not then a beating up on oneself, it is simply the relentless effort to do that which you know is the only thing satisfactory to be done for yourself. But if it is not relentless, you're back to beating up on yourself, because that is the only true escape from this meaningless, endless beating up on oneself, is to be relentless in the other area. The beating up on oneself being intrinsic to the thinking mode in consciousness, whereas what I'm referring to is the knowing mode, another state of consciousness that is not based on thinking. It is only in that state, and the relentless pursuit thereof, that you can be free from thinking, wherein to that it is native to uselessly beat up on yourself. Did that make sense? It did to me. Well, yeah, but you said it. Is that an excuse? I guess it might have let some fish off the hook. Yeah, but then a fish could say, well, just because it makes sense to you doesn't mean it makes sense. Well, back to the harsh part. Let's leave it on a good harsh, masculine sounding note. Let's compare the two again. Ordinary people. How about religious, real damn near fanatics? Just seriously religious people. They're people who spend more time and effort, observably, let's say, spend more time and effort on their religious practices, just ordinary religious, routine religious practices, than many so-called mystics do. You might include yourself in that. It's up to you. That is, that there are people who 7 days a week go to Mass or go to some church service, do something. They engage in prayer. They do something that they apparently, from observation, or they read their Bible or the Quran, that they spend more time engaged in their pursuit than, let us say, many so-called mystics. By the same token, even though it's something entirely different, the so-called mystic is wasting his time if he is not relentless in what he's doing. And by relentless, remember, it cannot be defined, even though I'll assume that you know what I'm talking about, because you either do or you don't, and I can't explain it any more than that, or won't try, that you have to be relentless in what you're doing. There is no other, because there's no guarantee. There is no foolproof method. There is no one trick. It's only ordinary people, according to whatever their belief system is, whatever external map they have, such as the fundamentalist Christians and many other religions say, all you've got to do is publicly confess that you believe in our God, that you believe in our system, and by so doing, you're okay. Then you're locked in, everything's safe after you die. So that's all you've got to do. There is no such one thing, there is no such thing guaranteed with someone attempting to establish another mode of consciousness within themselves, outside of thinking. There is no assured method, there is no one method, there is no guaranteed method, there is no the method. The closest thing to the method is not a noun, it's a verb. That is relentlessness, or an adverb. It's not a thing, it's an effort. And of course you got to know what you're trying to do, and primarily what you're trying to do is be conscious right now and quit beating up thinking, which is beating up on you. What is the thinking in you is not worthy of being beat up. It's not worthy of attention. But it's like the old joke, where I hate to do the common version. In the band, what instrument in the universe does a 6 trillion pound elephant play? Any instrument he wants to. What role does thinking play in a man's normal consciousness? Any goddamn role it wants to. Or how do you spell viscid? How do you spell glue? T-H-I-N-K-I-N-G. How do you spell irresistible attraction? Is she French? No, you're on the wrong track. Oh, I got it. T-H-I-N-K-I-N-G. You got it. You are dealing with something once you understand what the warrior's only obstacle is. And it is misnamed to call it an obstacle because it is his natural condition, and to think of it as actually being an active foe, being any specific individual form of opposition, ties one still into the framework of beating up on oneself. Although you may look at it as having bases outside of oneself, such as, well, things that happened to me in my childhood or influences. Beating up on oneself, when you can describe it, is a waste of time. It's an ordinary, common hobby, but it is not the relentless pursuit of an unnatural, of a supernatural goal, internally. And since the tape's out, that's all I've got to say. But it's not. But the tape's out. Well, be that as it may, but that's not all I had to say on it. But hadn't the tape run out? Hadn't it? Well, that's all I'll say. But you said you had more. Well, I do. Is the tape actually out?